right, I think we can get started. Well, welcome everyone to Geriatric Medicine Grand Rounds. I'm glad all of you could join us. I see some familiar names and faces on, and some folks who are joining us for the first time. So welcome to all of you. We have a really fantastic speaker this morning, and I'm really excited to introduce Charles Hoy-Ellis, who is going to give probably one of the best talks of the year, I think, maybe the best. He is a project director for interventions and training over at the Goldson Institute, which many of you might be familiar with. That's where the Aging with Pride study is, the Aging with Pride study is a core part of that, and he's been a co-investigator with that work for some time now, and has a lot of expertise. He is a licensed clinical social worker and has a lot of expertise in both counseling and in the psychology related to LGBTQ older adults and caregivers, and has worked with communities as well. And really, we couldn't have a better expert to talk to us about older adults, LGBTQ older adults, and thinking about heterosexism is so very important for all of us. And I think this is our first talk on that topic, and I'm very, very excited, and I'm going to let you take it away from here because I don't want to take up all your time. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much. I again appreciate the opportunity here. So today I'm going to talk about ways that we might address heterosexism in medicine. And first, I have to give the acknowledgement. So a lot of the research I'll be presenting today is funded by the National Institutes of Health, the National Institute on Aging. And what I present today is not necessarily the views of either of those institutes. I'm the one that's solely responsible for this. So these are the objectives for today. We want to understand how socio-historical cultural context have shaped biased medical practices and attitudes. We're also going to talk about some of the unique challenges that sexual and gender minority, LGBTQ, sexual and gender diverse older adults in healthcare settings experience. And then I'm going to wrap it up with some strategies for change. So these are some things we can actually take with us and do, and hopefully make our care provision better and make us better just all around human beings. So Aging with Pride, National Health, Aging, Sexuality, Gender Study is the basic research unit of the Goldson Institute. We are currently in the going into the 10th year of a longitudinal study wherein we're following 2,450 adults aged 50 and older who identify as sexual or gender minorities across the United States, with representation in all 9 census districts. So we take that and we take what we learned from that, kind of identify underlying mechanisms of risk and protective factors, and take that over to our Aging with Pride idea. So that's innovations, intervention, empowerment, and action. And so this is a culturally responsive intervention that we developed based on the RDAD model. And currently pilot testing some interventions for sexual gender minority older adults experiencing dementia. And then the third part of our Goldson Institute is our translation unit, Age Pride Center, Healthy Generations. And that's the hat I'm wearing today. So that's where we take the basic research, the intervention research, and bring it back to the community. So this is a quote from one of our participants, a 60-year-old queer person. Isolation, finding friend support, caregiving, and health are the biggest issues older gay people face. Who will be there for us? Who will help care for us without judgment? And that help without judgment is so, so critical. So we're going to get into Mr. Peabody's Wayback Machine and go back to 1967. This handsome young devil you see here wearing the eyeglasses is me when I was 7 years old, and the day I got my very first pair of glasses. What I did not know at the time was that by definition, I had a sociopathic personality disturbance. So I knew I was different from other boys, even at the age of 7. I had no idea how I was different. It was just this very inchoate, vague type of feeling, but I knew I was different. Up until I was 13, depending on where I lived in the United States, I was a statutory felon and remained a statutory felon depending on where I was in the United States until I was 43. And so I'll say a little bit more about that in a few slides. So actually 20 years ago, I started my MSW at the University of Washington, Seattle, and my advanced practicum was at Seattle Counseling Service for Sexual Minorities. Sadly, it went out of business last year. It was the original community mental health clinic specifically for the LGBTQ plus community. After I got my MSW, they hired me full-time staff. And one of the things that really kind of got me on the trajectory to get my PhD was I had learned in my MSW program about internalized stigma, things like that. But actually, what I began to see over time was that the vast majority of the clients that I was seeing who had mood and anxiety disorders, so generalized anxiety disorder, depression, things like that, it was either exacerbated or in some cases was actually and only the internalized heterosexism that they were carrying with them. And I began to see how just policies and just the atmosphere of where you live and work can really affect your mental health in profound ways. Another seed that was planted, and this is one of the challenges that some older sexual and gender minority adults experience. I had a client who was on the verge of turning 40 years old. And this was back in the early days of protease inhibitors. So there was a lot of physiological changes resulting from those protease inhibitors. So a lot of the fat that was distributed across the body, like in your face and your arms and your legs, would be redistributed around your belly. And so there was a term called Crick's belly. And he was coming up on his 40th birthday. He was HIV positive. And, I said, well, maybe we should start talking about you getting on medications. And he looked at me and said, I'd rather be dead than old. And what he was referring to was the ageism in the LGBTQ community. And it's more predominant among men than it is among women. And so what this is, it's in some ways, so in addition to neuroanatomical features of our brains, gay men and straight women share something else. And that is when we're young and beautiful, then we're valuable. But when we get old, we become worthless and we become rejected. So for many older gay and bisexual men and older transgender men, the community that they had actually found that they could finally belong to are now rejecting them for no other reason than because they're old. And so that was kind of one of the seeds that got me at the intersection of LGBTQ plus experience and the aging experience. So there are several factors that older LGBTQ adults experience. So there's the effects of stigma, past and present, and I'll be talking some more about that. We also rely more on informal families of choice who lack social and legal recognition. And so families of choice, so many of us who identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, gender diverse, two-spirit, there's an entire spectrum of language, did not have a really good time growing up because of who we were. And what we have done is we've developed families of choice. So these are typically friends, typically ex-partners who function as families are supposed to function. So I mentioned the IDEA intervention earlier, the intervention for LGBTQ plus adults age 50 and older experiencing cognitive impairment. And the vast majority of dementia interventions are targeted towards caregiving couples. And of those, the majority of those interventions are actually targeted towards the caregiver themselves. When we first launched the IDEA intervention, it was tragic to find out that actually over half of SGM older adults who wanted to participate, who were experiencing cognitive impairment, could not, because they could not identify a caregiver, an informal caregiver. So we've been recalibrating and have developed a couple of adapted interventions that we're in the process of pilot testing for those who are unable to identify a caregiver. And more broadly, and I'm going to really talk some more about this today, is the experience of unequal treatment under the law and programs for older adults. So although we in some ways have come a long ways since I was 13 and figured out that I was gay and knew what that meant, it's still, in more states than not today, it is still legal to deny people employment, housing, or public accommodations based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And as we've seen over the last couple of years, things are just getting really bad. Some people are actually moving their entire families out of state so that their transgender children can receive gender affirming care. So this is one of our earlier studies. This is based on the Washington State Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And what we did was we compared lesbian, gay, bisexual adults aged 50 and older to heterosexual adults aged 50 and over. We administered the Center for Epidemiological Studies Depression Scale short form, which in the absence of a clinical interview strongly suggests the presence of significant depression. And so you can see here, so this is the Burfus study. So about 7% of straight older adults were currently experiencing what we could consider depression, compared to 25% of lesbian, gay, bisexual adults. So more than 3 times the rate of depression among sexual minorities. Unfortunately, very, very few population-based studies ask questions about gender identity or expression. So this is one of our in-house studies. And so the blue here, we compared cisgender lesbian, gay, bisexual adults age 50 and older to their transgender same age peers. And you can see here almost half of transgender older adults were currently experiencing depression. And so the distance between these two areas, that's the health disparity. So those are the differences in population level health outcomes that are caused by social, environmental, and economic causes. These are some other statistics. So in addition to significantly higher rates of mood, anxiety disorders, suicidality, substance abuse, loneliness, isolation, things like that, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender older adults experience significantly higher rates of many chronic health conditions. And so you can see these here. So this was actually from the National Health Interview Survey that we did some analyses of. And so it's limited to cisgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual. But you can see with only 1 or 2 exceptions, there's significantly higher rates of chronic health conditions across the board for lesbian, gay, bisexual older adults. More recently, we did some studies on subjective cognitive impairment among women and men bisexual orientation, and with one exception. So all of these that you see here, the subjective cognitive impairment, severity, frequency, extent, and limitations due to cognitive impairments were significantly greater among lesbian, gay, bisexual compared to heterosexual adults age 45 and older. We also recently did a study. So we compared cisgender and transgender adults in our in-house study, the National Health Aging Sexuality Gender Study, and looked at 8 recommended preventive health care screenings that are recommended for those age 50 and older. And so as you can see here, the majority of cisgender lesbian, gay, bisexual adults age 50 and older are accessing these preventive healthcare screenings. And significantly less than half of transgender older adults are utilizing these recommended health screenings. And so this is going to have implications for their health. And we're also going to talk about some possible reasons why there is such a low rate of utilizing these preventive screenings among transgender older adults. So we all experience general stressors in our life, and we may not experience all of them. We not all experience them at the same time. But if we're here today, we've experienced the stress of schooling, of education, of taking tests and exams, and all of those good things. We all have probably lost a close relationship, and we know how heartbreaking that can be. Some of us have probably been unexpectedly fired, and so there's the economic repercussions and all the stress that that causes. But when we think about the health disparities that we see among sexual and gender minorities, there's growing, I'd say actually pretty solid consensus that these are caused by minority stressors. And so these are on top of the general stressors that people are already experiencing. So distally, people experience and expect to experience discrimination and victimization. And they also expect to be rejected from close friends, family members, employers, colleagues, if their sexual orientation or gender identity becomes known. So in an effort to protect themselves from being a target for discrimination or being rejected by those who are close to them, many people will conceal their sexual orientation or gender identity. In the short term, this is an excellent strategy for minimizing your chances of being targeted for discrimination and victimization. But in the long term, it becomes another long-term stressor. And then the most pernicious of all is internalized heterosexism. And we're going to talk about that some more. But we're all socialized from the moment we're born, actually, for most of us, before the moment that we're born. And so we all internalize these dominant cultural stereotypes, beliefs, and attitudes about historically marginalized populations. So racial, ethnic minorities, sexual gender minorities, people of immigrant status, socioeconomic status, all of these. So we have these minority stressors are what we think are explaining these disparate rates of health disparities. So what is heterocentrism, heterosexism, and heteronormativity? What does that look like? Well, this is a short clip. This is a documentary called Southern Comfort, and this is just like a minute and a half. But
it's Easter morning, and it's sunrise. And I wish I could understand why they did what they did, why they had to feel that way. And I know in a way they've contributed to my dying here. But I can't hate them. I don't hate them. I feel sorry for them. I can't say I actually forgive them for what they've done. I think that's more between them and God. But I don't hate them. I guess what makes me most sad is that they probably feel like they did the right thing.
this documentary, Southern Comfort, is following the life of this man who, the last year of his life, they're documenting the last year of his life. And the reason it is the last year of his life is that he's dying from ovarian cancer. The reason he's dying from ovarian cancer is because he was denied treatment by more than 20 physicians because they were more concerned about other patients in the waiting room and in the clinic being uncomfortable with a transgender man being there. So by the time he finally found a physician who could treat his cancer, it was too late to be treated. So heteronormativity is the idea that heterosexuality and being cisgender, that is, that your gender identity is congruent with the sex you were assigned at birth, is the only normal, natural expression of human sexuality and gender identity. And that's just a made-up fiction. So they have researched same-sex behavior, both sexual as well as relational, among more than 1,500 species, everything from earthworms to crabs to fish, to reptiles to birds to mammals. And in every single, without exception, with every single species they've looked at, they have identified same-sex homosexuality is the term we used to use. We try to get away from that term now. So for example, one that just tickles me pink is that they've identified seagulls who we would consider lesbian. So two female seagulls will relationally mate for life. Now, of course, because they're both biologically female, they can't fertilize an egg. So what they'll do is one of the female seagulls will sneak off. The remaining one will lure a male to the nest, and they'll do the dirty to fertilize the egg. Once the egg is laid, the other female seagull comes back, and together they chase off the male, and they will raise the chick themselves. And so that's just one example. So this heteronormativity is what all this discrimination and victimization is ultimately based on. So I told you earlier that by definition, I had a sociopathic personality disorder until I was 13. So in the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, homosexuality was classified as a sociopathic personality disorder. People could be and were often involuntarily committed. Treatments to cure their homosexuality incurred hysterectomy for women, castration for men, electroshock therapy, and even lobotomy. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association voted to reclassify homosexuality as a psychiatric disorder. And so homosexuality no longer per se was a mental illness, but if you were distressed about your sexual orientation, it was considered a mental illness. And this actually persisted until 1986. Most people aren't aware of that. And it was actually the medical profession that was administering these lobotomies and things like that. So imagine that you're a young person who identifies as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and you're growing up in this world where you know you could be involuntarily committed, and all of these terrible things happen to you. In 2003, until 1962, it was still a felony to engage in same-sex behavior in every single state in the United States. It remained a felony in 17 states in 2003 when the Loving v. Texas case went to the Supreme Court. So there were two men, both adults, both consenting adults, who were having sex in their bedroom. And one of the neighbors decided to call the police on them. So they were arrested for sodomy, which was a felony in Texas at the time. The Supreme Court struck that down. So in addition to involuntary commitment, people could be and were criminally arrested. So you see the newspaper clipping up there in the upper right-hand corner, 13 nabbed in crackdown on morals offenders here. So that was a 1956 newspaper story in the Tampa Tribune. For any of those who are watching this right now, who identify as women and who are wearing pants, you would be among those arrested, because it was actually 13 women who were arrested. And I was able to decipher some of the text. And the city vice squad said they were launching the opening salvo on the war against sex perverts. So these 13 women were arrested because they were wearing men's clothing, and for all appearances were men. So not only were they arrested for perversion because they were wearing men's clothing, their names, addresses, and employers were listed in the newspaper. And so it goes beyond that. they're all of these 13 women were school teachers, and they were all fired from their jobs and rejected from their families, all of this other stuff. So they had to actually leave their home and move to another state. And so again, think that you're a younger person, you're growing up in this atmosphere. And so these medical and legal institutions who actually treated you worse than animals were the ones who were doing this. And so think about your own life and your own experience, things that you might have experienced when you were growing up that still shape how you think about things and how you experience the world today. So today's LGBTQ plus older adults grew up during this time period, and it continues to affect them. One of our studies, we found that we did a series of hierarchical regressions analyses, and we found that LGBT adults age 50 and older who had been in an opposite sex marriage, but not a same-sex marriage, were significantly more likely to currently be experiencing depression. And what we, doing the more nuanced analyses, what we found it was that actually that those who had been in the closet longer. So part of our survey questions, we asked people how old they were when they first knew they were lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, and then how old they were when they first told someone that they were LGBT. And so again, that long-term concealment is a chronic stressor. And so it continues to show up. So we're currently working on a paper on allostatic load. And we're finding that constant overactivation and reactivation of the hypopituitary thalamic adrenal axis gets dysregulated to it's like the cortisol gets dumped too often, too much, too long, and becomes corrosive on both the body, the brain, and the mind. And so that accumulates over the lifetime. So outright discrimination is not as common today, although it certainly still is in some states. But what we know is that if you have two functioning brain cells and you're a human being, you are biased. You have bias. It's part of the socialization process. When we grow up, it starts first in our family. This is what boys do. This is what girls do. It's what Black people do. It's what white people do. It's what rich people do. This is what poor people do. So using myself as an example, I can remember when I was 5 years old and my father would beat me with a belt and I'd start crying and he'd get pissed and he'd beat me with a belt even more, calling me a crybaby and telling me he'd give me something to cry about. So that was how I learned that boys aren't supposed to cry, and if I show pain, I'm violating that gender norm, and so I'm going to be punished. When we start school, that socialization becomes even more profound. So that's where we start going to boys' rooms and girls' restrooms and boys' locker rooms and girls' locker rooms and all of those other things. And I hated PE because I was one of the couple of boys who was always the last to be chosen for whatever team we were going to be playing, flag football or whatever it was. And so you're standing there and they don't want you. They know they don't want you. Everybody knows that nobody wants you on their team because you're not athletic enough, you're not manly enough. So that's a more subtle type of discipline for violating gender norms. On the other hand, you have the ones who are always chosen as the team captain, who are, quote, natural athletes and all of that. And they get accolades and praise and awards, so they are rewarded for adhering to gender norms. The point I'm trying to make here is that every human being on the planet has bias. It's hardwired into us. So what this looks like is that that socialization, and there's conscious and there's non-conscious bias, and I'll go into that in just a second. But it's important to realize that medical professionals' diagnoses and treatment of patients can be influenced by their own non-conscious bias, which itself is an important contributor to these health disparities that I've been talking about. So according to our research, 1 in 7 SGM adults age 50 and older fear accessing healthcare services outside of the queer community. 1 in 8 have been denied care outright or provided inferior care. 1 in 5 are not out to their primary care provider. And according to the American Medical Association, they have since become much more positive about this, but they have recognized back in 2009 that patients' failure to disclose and physicians' failure to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity can have serious consequences for SGM older adults, such as delays in diagnosing a serious medical problem. This is from a different study, and so physicians themselves acknowledge, and trans people report that physicians deny them trans-specific care, or they don't know how to give them the care that they need. Transphobia has been identified as a barrier to quality care by trans people and by physicians. So transphobia is the word that was originally coined. I think we can find some more nuanced words today, but it's basically bias against transgender people. So I'm going to show another short clip here. This is about 4 minutes, and this is called Gen Silent. It's a documentary that follows the lives of 6 lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender older adults in the greater Boston area, and it documents some of their experiences in the healthcare system.
A lot of people believe that you just live happily ever after, and that just is a myth.
People like ourselves, older, are hiding in nursing homes or whatever because they are scared to death.
It's incredibly common to go back into the closet again.
You just know when they don't want you there.
We've heard about homemakers going in, taking out a Bible and having the elder pray and asking for forgiveness.
And to be cured. It's not too late for you to be cured of this. They go back in the closet. She might mistreat me or abuse me.
They're so afraid of it, they are resisting any kind of medical attention.
That person was in their mid-20s during the McCarthy era.
The closet was the norm.
They could lose their job, they could lose, families.
We were sick.
Just
we were
sick
We were
people.
considered sick.
People were involuntarily hospitalized in psychiatric facilities.
Even electroshock.
The degradation of these people is so complete that their sex satisfaction come only in being tortured themselves.
I was on the route to the nut farm.
So there's a real distrust of mainstream institutions.
I would never put myself in danger.
Time well.
He became much more fearful of people knowing that he was gay.
You're not leaving now, are you?
Not right now.
LGBT elders are more likely than the general population to age alone because many gay elders never had children, have not had great relationships with their families of origin. There would be a higher degree of sort of alienation and isolation.
My family was the reason I existed, and I lost them all. If they ever choose to catch up before I die, I welcome them.
LGBT aging issues are an epidemic.
There's a small and growing group of us.
We're trying to go into the existing network so they become more inclusive. One of the most common lines we get is like, we don't have any gay elders here.
If I wasn't the only person responsible for Alexander, I would have ended my life.
This is our life.
Good to see ya! Hi! We'll be there in a few years.
I built a stairway to paradise
with a new step every day. We have a whole generation of people who don't know who we are. That's really sad, because you're missing out on a lot. We know a lot. We did a lot for you. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for us.
Look at how scrawny they are. Too bad I don't have an open casket.
well, there'll be no open casket. There won't be anything, right?
If we are saying come out and be filled with pride, it's our responsibility to make sure that continues right through their last day.
So it's a great documentary. It's about an hour long. So if you ever get a chance to see it, I would. So my father had, both my parents had many explicit biases. And so this is conscious awareness that you think certain things about certain people based on stereotypes, but we all also have implicit biases. So these are our gut reactions. So the amygdala, that naughty little guy who lives at the base of our brain, detects potential threats in the environment and triggers the fight, flight, freeze response. So all that cortisol gets dumped into the body, like I was talking about earlier. We all have these, but we are often unaware that we have them, but they can directly affect healthcare outcomes as well as patient satisfaction. And so, I've been doing a lot of trainings in skilled nursing facilities here lately, and we try to do a pre-test, post-test to assess people's level of knowledge before the training and then after the training. One of the questions that we ask is for them to take a moment and reflect and kind of identify their own level of implicit bias towards LGBT, older adults, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other minorities. And it stuns me that so many say, I don't have any bias. Well, I encourage people to take the go to Project Implicit. So this is the implicit association test that's curated at Harvard University. There's a series of different tests, and it's actually really good at detecting your levels of implicit bias. So it doesn't say, hey, you have bias. It says something like, well, I'll share. When I first took it back 20 years ago, when I was in my MSW program, I took the racial ethnic implicit association test. And it told me that I had a moderate preference for the company of white people, which kind of startled me because I didn't consider myself as having an implicit bias. I also took the sexual orientation test and not surprised at all that it told me that I had a strong preference for the company of gay people, which, considering how many times I've been gay bashed and discriminated against, is not actually a surprise. I've been working on these implicit biases for a long time, and so they are much less than they have been. There will always be some residual there, but the more we're aware of these biases, the more we can do things to address them and to correct those biases. So here's some strategies for change. Here's some things we can do in terms of providing healthcare in medical settings. So we developed the health equity promotion model based on our research. And so when people go to the doctor or to a therapist or something, it's typically for physical or mental health conditions. So here on the right. And to some extent, during the initial assessment and hopefully the ongoing assessment, there'll be some questions about, your behavior. So your exercise, your diet, do you smoke, do you drink, things like that. I've been asked about my family structure. I've never been asked about my family of choice. I do understand the need to understand potential genetic contributors, but when we're talking about social and community, my family, when I came out to them when I was 15, they threw me out of the house that day, and we were estranged until just a year or two before my mother's and father's deaths. So these pathways, all of these factors here that you see, these biological, psychological, social, and behavioral factors, they can either promote or diminish health outcomes. What we don't look at, I do look at it in my therapeutic work with the queer community, but we don't look at the multi-level context of discrimination, victimization, microaggressions, internalized stigma, all of that. So all of this here in this red circle is the primary driver of all of this here that's mediated and moderated by all of this here. We also recognize that people have different social positions, so different intersectional identities. So I identify as a white cisgender gay man. So I experience heterosexism, but I don't experience racism or sexism. A transgender Black lesbian is going to experience racism, sexism, heterosexism, and cisgenderism. So the more of these you have, the more of these types you're going to be experiencing, and the more frequently and the more intensely you're going to be experiencing them. So there's going to be even a much stronger driver through here to here. And we also embed all of this in the life course. So things that happen earlier in life continue to affect us both physically and mentally throughout our lives. One way that it's been explained is advantage breeds advantage and disadvantage breeds disadvantage. And so it's important also to recognize that we are all of our social identities at the same time. It's not that I'm gay one day and I'm white another day. It's I'm always those things, but my awareness of them is based on the context that I'm in. So this is not a study that we did, this was a different study. And what they found is that when lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender patients perceive medical heterosexism, their trust in medical providers goes down, as does the quality of the communications between the providers. So this can result in the overall likelihood of being less likely to engage in a routine cervical cancer screening. So that's obviously specific to cisgender lesbian and transgender women, or I'm sorry, transgender men. So there's this thing that I just recently came across called narrative medicine. Now, I've used narrative therapy myself for many, many years. So narrative is essentially the stories that we tell. So narrative medicine is actually an educational aspect of medical education. So it blends the humanities, arts, all of these different perspectives to help diverse professionals, including physicians, nurses assistants, nurses, physician assistants, social workers, all of these to provide better person-centered care to enhance their own self-awareness, clinical efficacy, and creativity through narrative practices. So there's actually a lot of science behind, neuroscience behind storytelling. So neural coupling, when we're listening to or watching a story, our brainwaves synchronize with the story that the teller of the story's brainwaves. We get more emotionally connected through stories than we do through, for example, reading a list of ingredients. More parts of our brain light up when we're listening to a story or watching a story than if we are, again, reading a list of ingredients or reading a table of statistics or something like that. It also improves our memory. We retain our memories better through storytelling than through a recital of facts. Stories also allow us to maintain more attentional focus, and it also alters our neurochemistry. So this over here is, oh gosh, I'm gonna use the word oxytocin. So this is the feel-good hormone. So it's what keeps our parents from drowning us when we're babies. And it also influences behavior. So remember those behaviors in that pathway between heterosexism, discrimination, and health outcomes. So telling a story or listening to a story can actually influence people's behavior. Whenever I'm doing a training like this, one of the first things that I do to get a sense of institutional heterosexism. So this is actually a screenshot from this morning. I entered the Division of Gerontology and Geriatric Medicine in the University of Washington search engine. And you can see here, I actually did several variations of LGBT and got not a single result. Now, I'm sure there are reasons for that, but I actually find this more often than not. So if I'm looking for services and I do a search like this, and trust me, older LGBTQ adults are increasingly doing this, if I don't see anything there that could potentially represent me, I'm less likely to go there. When I walk into a clinic, what do I see? Do I see myself? Mostly I don't. So if I don't see myself represented as a gay man, then that's giving me two messages, one of two messages, either no recognition that I actually exist, or that my sexual orientation is not an important aspect of my lived experience and my health, when it absolutely is. If I were to see any one of these things, so for example, this report laying on a table in a waiting room, I'd say, wow, they recognize I exist. Alzheimer's Association recognizes I exist. AARP recognizes I exist. So, just a simple symbol can convey a lot. It's important to honor people's family of choice and to include that language in your family policy and visitation documents, and to include them in care planning. So I was very fortunate. My husband was seriously ill for several years, and I had to accompany him to all his doctor's appointments. And I was fortunate in that his care providers understood that we were a family. So it's important to develop and enforce policies and procedures that reinforce your commitment to inclusion. And this is important not just for your patients, but also for your staff, regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Titles 7 and 9 prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. So you can post a patient's Bill of Rights that includes LGBT terminology, and do that in high-profile areas so people walking by will see it. This is the Healthcare Bill of Rights partnered with the Human Rights Campaign. So if your patients see this is giving them a direct message that you recognize they exist and that they matter, and that you're committed to providing them equitable care. When it comes to hospital rooms, so I had surgery back in 1999, and unfortunately was in a shared hospital room with another person who was a man. But hospital rooms, to my understanding, shared rooms are based on sex assigned at birth and not on gender. This is going to become more and more of a problem as we go into the future, because in Washington State, driver's license and birth certificates can now have an X for sex instead of male or female. And so if a person identifies as X, which room are you going to assign, what kind of room are you going to assign them to? So with another male roommate or another female roommate. And this doesn't even get into people who are intersex. So it's important to update all your forms. Asking sexual orientation is incredibly important. It's as important as asking about race, ethnicity, or any other demographic that's important that we know addresses health, impacts health. It's also important to assess gender identity and gender expression. So these questions that I've just showed you, we have tested with over 4,000 adults over the last many years, and these seem to be getting the information that is important that we give, and it doesn't overburden participants. Physicians, educate thyself. There's a ton of really good documentaries and books out there about the experience of growing up gay and growing older as gay. So Brother Outsider is an excellent movie. This man who's actually the architect, Bayard Rustin, the architect of the civil rights movement, was actually a gay man, but nobody knows that. So this is a documentary for The Bible Tells Me So that I recommend to people of religious faith, because it follows 5 American Christian families who each have a queer child, and their journey from initial rejection to ultimate reconciliation. It's also important to be familiar with community resources. So these are all national resources that are available. The LGBT Aging Project is part of the Fenway Institute in Boston. The Forge is specific to transgender aging. Diverse Elders Coalition is just what it says it is. It's a coalition of racial, ethnic minorities, sexual gender minorities, people with differing abilities and things like that. So be aware of all of these resources. There's also some that are recommended specifically for physicians. So this is Johns Hopkins Center on Aging. If you, or if you know someone who identifies as LGBT and they're in crisis, this national hotline is available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and is available in English and Spanish. You can go to our website, just goldstoninstitute.org. We have this resource guide here. It's about 38 pages in length. It's a freely downloadable PDF of different resources for LGBTQ people and providers in Washington State, as well as some nationally. So I want to close this with another quote from one of our participants. So in spite of the health disparities, in spite of the discrimination, the victimization, and all of the crap that we go through, I absolutely agree with this man when he says, in spite of some of the hassles I've had in my life because I'm gay, I consider being gay a gift. It has made my life richer and opened so much of the world for me. Of course, if I had it to do over again, there are some things that I would have done differently, but being gay isn't one of them. When I was 16 years old, if there was a pill that would have turned me straight, I would have paid $1 million for it. I turned 63 this year, and you couldn't pay me enough $1 million to take a pill to turn me straight. I'm quite happy being gay. Thank you very much. And so I do want to say thank you very much. And here's our different contact information. Again, just go to goldstoninstitute.org and you will find us there. If you go to the Programs and Training tab, every research study that we've ever published is freely available on that website under resources. And so I've been asked to make sure that this was the last slide and to keep it up on the screen. So that is the end of my formal presentation. And it looks like we have about 7 minutes if anyone has any questions or observations or comments.
Thank you so much for that talk. I feel free to unmute or I think someone had a question already. Just go ahead. Harry.
Such a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Really appreciate your vulnerability and your brilliance, really. Sad to hear Seattle Counseling Service closed. Yeah. So are you, there are many, I think, LGBTQ friendly behavioralists, but is there a center where people can go that has a higher likelihood of finding one?
Not that I'm aware of, but don't take that as gospel. So I completed my PhD at the UW Seattle in 2015 and took a job as an assistant professor at the University of Utah. So my husband and I were there for 7 years, and we actually just moved back to the Pacific Northwest in some semblance of sanity last year. So to my knowledge, there is not, I do know that there are individual therapists and behaviorists who do provide services to the LGBTQ community, but I'm not aware of any particular community mental health agency that is more likely to provide affirming care. So maybe I should do that.
Don't know if you can see the chat, but you're getting some thank yous for various aspects of what you shared with us. Much appreciated, the resources in particular. Any other questions that folks have?
Well, not a question, but more of a comment. Charles, I really appreciate you actually sharing our department website and the search term. That was really disappointing for me to see that, because I want us to do better. So I just really appreciate you highlighting that. And that's really lit a fire for me in terms of how we can think about the spaces that we take care of older adults and how to make sure that they feel seen.
Well, thank you for that. And I am grateful because it's, I think it was Maya Angelou who said, or it could have been someone else, I apologize, but she said, when we know better, we can do better. So it's not that we're bad people or anything. It's often that we just don't know. And so unless someone brings it to our awareness, we can't do anything about it. But once we do have that awareness, we can start working with that awareness. So thank you very much. And thank all of you for this opportunity. I still occasionally pinch myself when I recognize the fact that I actually get paid to do this stuff. So, you know, it's my passion in life, and the fact that I get paid for it, it's like ice cream. So thank you all very much for the opportunity.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing the time with us. It looks like Elizabeth Phelan has her hand up. If you have, I think we have time for another question.
Sure.
Oh, great. Yeah. I was wondering if you have any resources to recommend for talking with family members where they're, you know, a patient might be wanting help discussing their gender identity with their family.
Yeah, so that one slide that had the national resources, so there's a agency called Forge. It's primarily an online entity, but if you just put Forge, like Forge and Hammer into your Google search engine along with transgender, it'll take you directly to their site. There's also another one if you enter SOFA, SOFFA. So that's one specifically for friends, family, and loved ones who have transgender friends, relatives, whatever, and want to better understand their experience and to be supportive.
Great, thank you.
You bet. Also, one of our publications that I would recommend, it's called Creating a Vision for the Future. What we did, we actually did develop this a few years ago. We took 10 social worker competencies and asked ourselves, what would these competencies look like for any healthcare provider providing care specific to LGBTQ older adults? So up front, we give a little bit of the background that I've just given you, but then we follow it with 10 specific strategies on working with LGBTQ older adults, regardless of what kind of care you provide. And so that would also be applicable to friends and family members also.
Fantastic. I don't know if you might be willing to share your slides with us, but there are so many great resources in there. So you can let us know about that.
What I can do is I'm more than happy to share, I'll turn them into a PDF and share them. We have shared them before and asked that they not be reshared, only to find them in Google Images and places like that.
Yeah, well, whatever you most feel comfortable with as far as sharing some of the resources with us.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this time. I know that I learned a lot this hour and have homework to do, specific actions that we need to take as a division and that I myself need to take as a human and a healthcare provider. And it's not every day that I go to a talk that gives me that motivation to change. So thank you so much for what you shared and for just how fantastic this talk was. I really appreciate it. And I hope that we can all take something away and make changes going forward.
Thank you all very much, and you're more than welcome. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.